Hey guys, how's it going? So I wanted to record a quick video to go over the basics of percentage-based hair shading, just because there's a really massive lack of information out there, and I think it's a really helpful technique. And it's still something that's quite new to public sphere, so I may as well get it out there. Some credit has to go to Jesus Fernandez. He's one of my ex-co-workers and a close friend of mine, and he's one of the guys who kind of introduced me to the concept of this. And I've had quite a lot of fun kind of converting it to Yeti in this case. But yeah, it's a great technique. It basically allows you to, rather than plug in a fur color map that your hairs pick up as like normal texturing, it allows you to create masks that pick up a percentage of hairs. So if you want 1% of hairs to be white, but then you want a different region where 50% of hairs are white, that would be something that, to do that in a texture, would require incredibly high resolution maps to pick out individual hairs, which obviously is not feasible. So percentage-based hair shading allows you to do that. It's a bit of a paradigm shift. It's definitely not a normal way of working, and for most projects it is completely unnecessary. However, it's something that's really good to have in your back pocket as a technique you can use. So what actually is it? Basically, the thought process behind it will apply to XGen or Yeti or Houdini or many groom tools that allow you to add custom attributes. Fundamentally, the workflow is to assign a random value to hairs, and then use that random value to pick a mask, basically. So to make things simple, I usually work with a value of 0 to 1, and then check if it's lesser than or greater than a percentage-based map. So we'll go through the process. The process, obviously, I'll be going through is with Yeti. However, the theory behind it will apply to any other groom tool that allows custom attributes. So let's get started by just walking through the scene quickly. I'm going to close this render. This isn't using percentage-based hair shading, by the way. This is just a generic hair shader. We will go through building a more extreme shader, and then obviously you guys can apply that knowledge and make really beautiful hair shaders. But for the sake of keeping this video less than 10 hours long, let's make a very basic shader that shows the theory. So scene setup is very simple. It's just a Yeti groom on a plane, and that plane is on a plinth. That plinth is on a table, all that jazz. Hair for scale, because that's a running gag now. And yeah, the Yeti shader, or the Yeti groom itself is pretty standard. There's one thing that's a little bit unusual, but it doesn't affect what we're doing today, which is, rather than building guides, I went the lazy way and made my guides procedurally. Basically just scattering some hairs, using a direction node to bend them in a direction, applying some scraggle with uniform distribution just to kind of get a bit of a waviness to it, and then converting that to guides and using that to comb actual hair. So that's the only unusual thing, but other than that, if you ignore this bit, it's a completely normal groom. You got some scatters, grows, combs, clumping, some scraggles, width, and an attribute at the end here. So if we just skip to this part, this is the groom setup fundamentally. We do have this extra node at the end, which is creating root UVs. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail with that because it's not specific to hair shading or to percentage shading. It's just hair shading general stuff. However, if you want to learn how to do this, just freeze on this frame, have a look at these settings, and that will be how you can set up root UVs to apply to a shader. And you can apply other parts of this lesson to know how to hook this up. And then this node up here, which is just kind of sat off to the top, is just to preview those root UVs, just so I can see, where is 1, 1 on UVs, where's 0.5 or whatever. But again, this isn't hugely relevant to what we're doing. This is kind of generic, so kind of keep that in your back pocket. But that's a new phrase I've started saying a lot now. But yeah, so I guess we should get started on actual percentage hair shading. We're only a few minutes into this. So the first thing we want to do is create a random value per hair. Again, this value will allow us, with it being random per hair, to assign unique values for every hair in terms of the actual texturing itself. So we do need that as a base. Without having a random value per hair at this stage, nothing else works. So how do we do that? I'm just going to create a attribute node and plug that in right here. Now, you don't have to name it, you don't have to be clean with everything, but I prefer to anyway, so I'm just going to call this rand value And then the attribute itself, I'm also going to call rand value. You could call this anything you want. It doesn't actually affect anything. Only what we put here and here and here affects the actual data. So you could call this Steve if you really wanted to, and it really wouldn't affect the workflow. We then move on to default. So this is where we actually assign a value to the hairs. Currently it's set to 1, 1, 1, which is a color, a vector. And this equals white because it's 1 in the red, 1 in blue, and 1 in green. Oh, 1 in green, 1 in blue. RGB? Yep, there we go. However, I don't need a vector. I just need one random value per hair. If you're familiar with Yeti, you know that you can get a random value by typing hash and then putting ID. Hash itself just generates a random value based on the seed which is in the brackets. Putting ID in that seed means that you are giving a unique value per hair. Hash, its primary kind of use and also limitation is that it only generates values between 0 and 1, but for what we plan to do today, that's actually exactly what we need. So hash ID is all we need to do for this guy. Then we go to attribute type. We can put vector or float. Now in this case we only need one random value per hair, so float is fine. Vector is what you do if you want to do, for example, root UVs, or if you want to actually put color in your hair using Yeti rather than a texture. Personally I wouldn't do that, but it's an option. But we'll just leave that float. And then detail type, I'm going to set to varying so that every hair can receive a unique value. And we only need one value per hair, so we don't need anything like vertex. So that's that setup. Now, let's have a quick look as to what that's actually doing. So obviously we can't see anything when we click here, so I'm going to create a shader node. And I'm going to type rand value in there. And currently we're not previewing it, so let's just view that. And this is our attribute. This is essentially what we're sending to the renderer, or what we will be sending to the renderer. I'll get back to that in a moment. And you can see how every hair, there's no variation per hair, but across the groom, each hair has a separate color. So this hair is black for the full length, this hair is like half gray for the full length, this hair is almost white for the full length. So you can see how we've got that one value. I'm just going to quickly name this. So preview, and then let's call that rand value. Now something I mentioned a moment ago is that we're going to send this to the renderer, but currently, if you're eagle-eyed or you know Yeti already, you'll know that we haven't yet. And the reason being is because we haven't looked at the mapping tab in the attribute node yet. So mapping is what essentially allows you to hand over attributes and say, hey, it's not just Yeti that needs to use this, I need to use this in Arnold, or I need to use this in Redshift, or wherever you're taking these attributes. So we need to make sure that we check map as renderable attribute. And a kind of secondary part of this page is the attribute and mapping boxes. Now, I'm going to leave these blank, and the reason I'm going to leave these blank is this is primarily for taking an existing attribute and renaming it before you send it to Arnold, which personally I don't understand why you'd do that. I'm sure there is a case for it, but it doesn't make sense to me. However, if both of these are left as blank, it just takes this attribute name and puts it in both, like behind the scenes. You can check that by right-clicking on the node, going to mapping, and you'll see rand value is mapped to rand value. You can also see other attributes like normals is mapped to surf n for Arnold, so you wouldn't be able to put n, you'd have to put surf n. And there's lots of like other details in here, which is kind of helpful. But yeah, so this is now set up to go to Arnold. So let's just quickly save our scene, and I'm going to open the hypershade. So currently we have a very basic render setup. The render was done using this material up here, basic hair mat, which is just a standard AI standard hair with a little bit of melon randomization, so it's not using per hair, percentage shading. There we go, got there eventually. Although it is random per hair, it's just with one slider. We don't have a huge amount of control on this. I'm going to not use this for our test though, just because melanin shading is its whole kind of thing. I want to keep this as basic as possible, so we're going to switch to another standard hair material, but I'm going to use diffuse. That will just make our renders a little bit quicker, make the results a lot more visible, and also in the process be completely physically incorrect. Don't use diffuse for your hair shaders. Or at least don't use a diffuse weight of 1. So let's just assign that to there and do a quick test render. So that wasn't that quick of a render. I just rendered this before. So this is what it currently looks like. And you'll notice, obviously, it's completely grey, which is kind of useless to what we want to do and doesn't show us really anything of the percentage shading. So let's get started on incorporating that. So the first thing we want to do is learn how to actually import those attributes that we've made. So we made the rand value attribute. So in Arnold, and this applies to most renderers, there is a node specifically for it, but in Arnold that node is called AI user data. So we have a few options here, and in the case of what you'd use with Yeti, you'd only really use the top two, which is color and float. Color is a vector, it's red, green and blue. So if you're using a vector in your Yeti attribute, then you need to use user data color. If you're using a float, like we are for our random value, you want to use AI user data float. So we're just going to put that there. And I'm going to name this immediately. Yeti rand value. This may kick up an error. No, it didn't. Cool. I thought it might kick up an error just because this is like the third take of this video. So I didn't know if I deleted the files or not. But yeah, so we've got this. Currently it would do nothing, just because we're not actually telling it to read an attribute. So we're just going to type the name of the attribute in here. Now it's important that this is typed exactly as it was mapped in Yeti. If even the case sensitive, like if you type this wrong, it will not find the attribute. Arnold doesn't know what you're looking for, it just does blindly what you tell it. So that will actually bring in our Yeti attribute. So I'm just going to plug that for now into diffuse red, green and blue, just so we can render it directly. So now you can see how we got in this kind of like salt and pepper thing. So there are hairs of every value. There's some hairs in here that are like 0.2, there's some that are 0.6, and some that are 0, some that are 1. Doesn't really matter, to be honest. The point is that we now have our random value. So now we can actually start using this for percentage shading. So the simplest possible setup is to create a ramp. So I'm just going to create a ramp texture, and I'm going to plug this out value into the V coordinates. And because this is a V ramp, it's now going to use this along here. So let's just plug that into color and start rendering again. So where this becomes helpful is if I set interpolation to none, we see it immediately goes black. So if you look at this bar is now your percentage. So I'm going to actually invert these colors and set that to be white. So now the amount of this bar that is white is telling us how many of our hairs are going to be white. So I can just slide this over here, and now 50% of our hairs, or actually 47.5% of our hairs, are now white. As I slide this over here, we get less and less. So you can see how we're picking out individual hairs now. If I go there, we've now got 2% of hairs set to this white color. Granted, currently it's just using the actual ramp color itself. This isn't technically percentage shading yet. It's getting closer though. It's showing the general thought process. But you can see how this is doing some cool stuff. I could set this to be crazy colors, and you can see how that's kind of doing its own thing now. So we're getting all these like random values in here. Well, not random. We're getting 50% of the hairs, or 43.8% of the hairs are red and white, and the rest are blue. So how do we actually get this into percentage shading? Because currently this is just a really hard to control, not understandable at all map. Well, the easiest way, or well, the only way that I use anyway, is a greater than or less than operation. So we want to check if this is going to be larger than a map that we paint. So let's just quickly get rid of you. And I'm going to create a condition node. Okay. And first term is going to be you. And the second term is going to be another ramp. Probably should have just kept the previous one, to be honest. And I'm going to connect a user data color and set this to root UVs, which is my standard naming, and plug that in like so. Plug you in there. Oh. Second term. And finally plug you into diffuse color. So now is where it actually starts to become a map. So we're just going to need to quickly go in and set this to greater than for now. So you can see how this operation is where we set, well, what operation we're using, and then below it says the color if true and the color if false. Personally, I don't really understand why this is the case. I would expect true to be a value of 1, just because 1 is normally true in computer programming, but apparently not in this case. So what this is now telling us, if this is greater than whatever this ramp is giving us, we get returned a value of 0. And if it's less than, we get returned a value of 1. So let's just quickly start this rendering. And look at that, we've got a little bit of a ramp. Now, what you'll notice about this ramp, if I zoom out, we can see it's very clearly a ramp. But as we zoom in, there's no grey values here. It's entirely black or white. So over here, there's like a very small percentage of hairs that is actually set to white, and the rest is set to black. And as we go over here, it's the opposite. Most of the hairs are white with some set to black. So this is essentially where percentage-based shading comes in. You could replace this ramp with any map. You could replace it with a fractal, you could replace it with a checkerboard, and just do this less than. And that's going to give you full control over where specific colors are placed. So you can do something like that. You don't have to set this to any other type of blend, but I generally like to use exponential. They just visually look a little bit nicer to look at. But you can see how that's like, you know, kind of a cool thing. So now it's a case of, great, you know, we've got this black and white thing, but what are we supposed to do with it? So the way that I like to see this is we now have a mask. This is only driving, you know, whether something is true or false. We're not actually using this, or we're not supposed to be using this yet, as color. So let's get into using that. I'm going to pause this for a moment, and I'm going to create a layer RGBA. In the first input, it's just going to be my base color. So let's just start with something really garish. I'm not going to go that bright because it's really hard on the eyes. Something like this. And in mix 2, I'm going to plug in this guy and connect out color over here. So we now have completely red when I turn this on. Let's just set this to overwrite. We're now switching over to this color. So now we can actually add whatever color we want in here. So we can switch to a more blue tone, something like this. And this is now purely acting as a mask. So this is where I like to get a little bit tricky with it. So there's a million ways you can now use this. Obviously you could plug in multiple ramps, you can plug in multiple textures, fractals, whatever you want to use. I'm just going to create 3 layers for now, just to keep life a little bit simpler. So all I'm going to do is just quickly create another ramp and another condition. So let's just get rid of these guys. Cool. And actually, let's name this condition. I like to call these is blue. Cool. Let's create another condition. Plug you into second term. Cool. And this one is going to drive, let's just say, a percentage of white hairs on top of all this. So let's just go, no, we just want you. And, okay, we need to show all attributes. Cool. Let's go mix 3. Enable that. Cool. This isn't actually rendering right now, or it shouldn't be. There we go. And I'm just going to call this red fur, blue fur. Keep that consistent. And let's just call this white strays. Set this to white, and hit play on this guy. And we need to set this to greater than. And what we can do now is just treat this as a amount. So just set something like this, and you can now see how we have, let's just set that down to like 2. So this is now 2% of all hairs, and now set to this white color. So this is basically percentage shading. I've not gone into a huge amount of detail. I don't want to go too far beyond 20 minutes, maybe 25 at max. But you can see how, if you imagine replacing these ramps with textures or fractals, you can now see how essentially to create this, even if it is very ugly in this case, to create this we would need a ridiculous resolution map. So I don't want to beat a dead horse, but you can see how this is allowing us quite a lot of control. I can say, for example, stuck typing, there we go. I can say, for example, let's just have a small section here, which is a way higher percentage. And now we've got a stripe of more white hairs, but it's not blending, and that's the important bit. We're getting unique values here. And you can always, if you want a per hair variation, just at the very end, add this random value in, like at the very bottom, and set to multiply, and that will just allow each, or well, multiply is a random example, but that would allow you to get control over per hair variation, and this allows you to get a general kind of color map in place. Now obviously there are other ways you can use this, so just to throw ideas at the screen, one thing you could do instead is in the colors put a color map. Let's just say you paint like 3 different fur color maps. You could put one in here, a different fur color map in here, a different fur color map in here, and use this to blend between them, so that you still get per color variation or per hair variation, but you're switching back and forth between maps you've already painted. So you have, when you start doing that, you have a ludicrous amount of control over like the final look. But yeah, so that's the primary technique. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this off camera and just get a pretty render. And yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed this. If anything wasn't clear, by all means, feel free to say. I'm more than happy to go back and re-record if need be. But yeah, enjoy the rest of your night, and I hope you find this technique helpful. Bye, guys.